So today's presentation is titled, Navigating Common Problems When Leading Change, Strategies for Champions to Succeed. It is with great pleasure that I introduce our speakers for today, Jamaisie Sutherland and Catherine Wallace. Jamaisie, also known to us as Macy, is an Implementation Science Manager here at RNAO. In her role, she supports BPSO organizations, both pre-designates and designates, as they work towards implementing best practice guidelines in the organization. Macy graduated from Ryerson University in 2011 and decided to pursue one of her passions, neuroscience nursing. As a neuronurse, most of her expertise is in the management of epilepsy and movement disorders. In her last role prior to joining RNAO, she was a deep brain stimulation nurse in a movement disorder program in Toronto. Macy is also very passionate about health equity and helping organizations to implement best practices that will improve patient and staff outcomes. Catherine Wallace is a registered nurse and previously a registered midwife. Catherine has worked at the RNAO for the past 8 years. She is currently the senior manager of the implementation science team that supports healthcare, social service, and academic organizations, including RNAO's PPSOs, to successfully implement RNAO's best practice guidelines. For the past 2 years, Catherine has been part of the Leading Change Toolkit development team, including as a project lead for the past year. This toolkit is a new online evidence-based implementation resource published in 2021 and is available at no cost on the RNAO website. So welcome, Jamaisie and Catherine.
Thank you so much, Patricia, for such a warm welcome. It's with great pleasure that we have the opportunity today to speak to you on the topic of strategies to navigate and resolve common problems of change initiatives. Today, we will discuss some common problems such as loss of momentum, lack of energy, stale dated communications that no longer inspire staff, and opposition to the change by staff. Our goal is to provide you with some evidence-based and practical strategies from the Leading Change Toolkit that you can consider when addressing these common problems.
Thanks, Macy and Patricia and Andrew. So welcome everyone. So again, our content today derives from the Leading Change Toolkit that Patricia introduced. This is an online implementation resource that was published in October of 2021. And as you can see, it's developed for people like yourselves, for change agents and those involved in change teams to make lasting improvements in healthcare, available online through the RNAO website. The Leading Change Toolkit includes 2 implementation frameworks. The Knowledge to Action framework, one I know that all of you are very familiar with, a systematic structured process model, and in addition, the Social Movement Action framework, a newer framework that we developed in 2020. The Social Movement Action framework applies social movement action, that's grassroots, people-led action for knowledge uptake and sustainability. So both of these frameworks, Knowledge to Action framework and Social Movement Action, both are focused on knowledge translation, the successful uptake of best practice guidelines to create practice changes. And today in our presentation, we'll focus on some of the components from both of these frameworks.
So let's take a moment to review a case scenario that can oftentimes be seen in many organizations. In this particular case, we have a health organization who's in the process of starting implementation activities, following 6 months of planning with active stakeholder feedback. In the past, they've had previously implemented 3 best practice guidelines and have been able to sustain most of the practice changes. However, 2 years ago, all of their implementation activities stopped due to the pandemic, and the majority of staff are being deployed. Also, recently, the change team has tried to resume implementation activities but are experiencing many challenges, including the following. Momentum is slow to regain. Staff expresses that they do not have the energy for change. The messaging regarding the change seems to be still dated, and also staff are now opposed to the change as an area of priority. We will use this case study to set the stage for our discussion today, and we'll present to you some suggested strategies that can be considered and tailored to the local context within your organization.
Thanks, Macy. And before we get into looking at why those 4 areas are problematic and why some strategies are indicated, just a reminder of these 4 related principles of change. And for those of you who attended the presentation last month on change teams, we used the same slide, and it's very much applicable again in this situation. So a reminder that change never occurs in isolation. That the focus solely on the change itself and not consideration of the local context really puts us at a disadvantage. So it's about a change and a change in a specific setting. And that local context can be anything from the people, the staff involved, leadership, the compatibility of the guideline with the current context, the current energy of the organization, available budget, resources, competencies, etc. But change is always influenced by this other huge variable known as the local context. Really must be considered both the change and the local context. Similarly, we need to think about that change is completed, conducted by individuals, by teams, by groups. And so there is this inherently social process of change that very much influences how a change initiative unfolds. At its optimal, it'll support a change process, but where those social processes are challenged, are difficult, are strained, that will absolutely impact change. And then lastly, related to this, is that change occurs at the speed of trust. The more risky the change is, either the change itself or the context in which change is occurring, the more we need that in the trust in order to move change forward. So Macy had given us the case scenario, and we're hearing about a health organization that has implemented 3 BPGs successfully. By successfully, we mean that they've been able to achieve the practice change and to sustain it. And now they're moving on to their 4th BPG, and they had begun this process wisely using KTA framework as a guide for their change process. So they had moved through these first 3 phases of identifying the problem, of considering local context, engaging their stakeholders, considering resources, and assessing barriers and facilitators to knowledge use. And now they were ready to implement interventions when the pandemic occurred. So our question for you, and we'd ask you to put this in the chat box, is whether it's a good idea for this team to just try and resume their practice change, to resume where they kind of left off 2+ years ago. Can they do that? Is that a good idea? What would be the pros and cons of that? Or are they better off just starting all over again because just too much has changed? So if you'll put that in the chat box for us, do you think that they should resume where they were or start over, and some rationale for that as well, why your advice would be that? And at the end of the presentation, Patricia is going to summarize some of your findings. So thanks for that in advance.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So moving on, if you recall from the case we just read, it was mentioned that the team is having difficulty regaining momentum. So then, oops, I think I moved a bit too quickly. So to understand why a loss of momentum can be problematic for teams, we first have to examine what is momentum. So momentum is a force or impetus that creates energy and attracts individuals, groups, and or organizations to a shared concern or desired change. And the force is so powerful that without it, change teams find it hard to even initiate and sustain change. If we were to use a car as an analogy, the engine can be likened to the force of momentum. We all know that without the engine in the car, it will be very difficult to move that car. So when we think of this car analogy, champions can be considered, or champions or change agents can be considered the drivers of the car, and the stakeholders are your passengers. And so both champions and stakeholders have the ability to speed up or slow down momentum depending on the shared concern and urgent need to take action. There must be an agreement on the direction in which they want to proceed. It is also important to know that momentum, when enacted, is unstoppable and continues even in the absence of external forces, such as management intervention. Without momentum, the change initiative will plateau, run out of energy, and fail to advance. And when momentum is declining or absent, the social movement no longer attracts the interests of others, and the critical mass is not sustained. So what can we do in this particular case where the team is experiencing challenges with regaining momentum? So we're going to talk about some strategies that can be used to address the loss of momentum. So first of all, focusing on social connections. So focusing on social connections amongst individuals, groups, and organizations where possible. And you want to seek face-to-face interaction to maintain social ties. You also want to use existing networks where available to support connectivity and widen the circle of engagement. Remember to be inclusive and outward facing. So you want to encourage and welcome new change agents, as this will help to build the necessary critical mass that you need. Also, aiming for small wins is important in helping to build momentum. It is important to communicate these wins using narratives or storytelling to gain attention and visibility. You want to emphasize the wins, that the wins reflect and the progress and the success that the team has so far. And also be responsive to questions and concerns raised by new potential supporters or others to clarify the shared concern or desired change and the goals of the social movement. Discuss barriers if goals have not been met, or any additional resources that may be needed. Ensure that there's clear communication regarding roles and expectation. Another strategy is that you can use all opportunities to learn and spread knowledge uptake and best practices. You may also want to consider engaging champions and other change agents to share optimism about the change, believe in the change and the possibility of doing things differently and applying social movement actions. You want to actively support champions as advocates for the change and encourage them to communicate the sense of urgency for the shared concern or the desired change and the need for action. Lastly, use motivation to keep forward movement. At each planning meeting, take the time to highlight goals and what has been accomplished to date by the team. And on your screen, you'll see some resources here for momentum. So if you're, this particular resource is presented on the slide as a worksheet with guiding questions to support momentum.
Thanks, Macy. So the next area of concern is that the staff say they don't have the energy for change. And so we want to look at, again, why is this problematic and what are some strategies we can think of to rebuild energy for change? And energy for change in the social movement action framework is part of a precondition. It's something that needs to be present in order for change to occur. So it's something we need to pay attention to. So why is this problematic? Well, energy for change, it's the drive, the ability to take action and achieve goals for a specific purpose. So energy very much tied to a change initiative. We might have energy for one specific change, but not another. But we know that its presence is essential for change to be able to move from being planned to change actually occurring. That without energy, the change cannot move ahead. It won't, as it indicates that the team's lack of receptivity to the change, the readiness for change. And why can there be a lack of energy for a specific change initiative? It's either typically because the shared concern, the focus of what we want to change, is no longer valued or necessary. If it's not seen as a priority, that drives that energy, and or that the change is not seen as feasible. It may be something that we say, yes, we'd like to do, but we don't have the energy, the resources, the capability right now, the people to make that change. So thinking about some strategies, and just first let's understand a little bit more about the energy for change. And this is work that was developed from the NHS, looking at 5 different domains of energy. And their conclusion was that you need all 5 different types of energy in order to achieve optimal change and optimal change teams. Again, we mentioned earlier that change is very much an inherently social process. And so again, we're looking at those interactions of individuals and how that impacts the change process. And we also can understand then how the energy for change can be low and be impacted by something like the pandemic. Starting with this energy of social energy, this is about staff's engagement and connection with one another. And if, as a result of the pandemic, there's been huge changes in staffing, perhaps a lot of new staffing, that can change the social energy. People maybe don't feel as connected to one another, don't have the same amount of history, don't have the same opportunities just to talk with one another and get to know one another because of the busyness of the work. The spiritual energy, you can see that's the commitment to a shared purpose or a common vision. This may be lower as a result of the pandemic because of moral distress, because of individuals feeling they can no longer provide the very best care, because of the circumstances and the demands that have been as a result of the pandemic. So spiritual energy as a team may be low. Physical energy, you can see that's the ability about getting things done and making progress. Physical energy may be very low as a result of the pandemic because of the health human resource crisis, because of inappropriate workloads, too many patient clients to take care of, and a lack of time for renewal, for breaks, for vacation, that give people that renewed energy to be able to get things done. The intellectual energy, this is the energy of analysis, of planning, of thinking. This reflects our competencies, our knowledge and skills. And in some ways, this may be a source of energy that's had less of an impact as a result of the pandemic. Nonetheless, our intellectual energy is furthered by things like professional development, by attending, for example, a webinar like today, and the ability to focus on our work and not have to multitask again. So if we've been in situations, as many of us have during the pandemic, been unable to focus on professional development, our intellectual energy also may be lower. And then finally, psychological energy, that's the ability to take risks. And if you look at the graphic, I quite like it. It shows that as we move through a process of change, we must step through this chasm of uncertainty. And in order to do that, it takes psychological energy. Psychological energy, this can be low because of working under chronic fear, a lack of trust, or weariness. It reduces our psychological energy for change. So some suggested strategies, and for this one, there is no quick fix. This takes time. Beginning with understanding why the energy for change is low versus judging it. Understanding that energy for change is dynamic. It can change if it's the right cause and the right people in the right time. But understanding it ebbs and flows, and that often after a time of intense energy expenditure, it will be low. That's normal. It allows time to reflect and renew and create balance. And it tells us where additional supports are needed. And it's something that can be measured. And in the Leading Change Toolkit, we do have a tool that comes from this work by the NHS on assessing your group's energy domain. So look for that on the link that we've included on this page. Also in the Leading Change Toolkit, in the Knowledge Action Framework, you'll find a resource that walks you through if you're considering using a tool like this one on assessing group energy domains, some considerations for choosing a tool, implementing that tool, and then what next to do with that tool as far as the results. Again, in the toolkit, you'll find some additional strategies to raise energy domains, as well as a link to the resource from which this information has been determined. So next, let's look at the messaging. The communications regarding the change seem stale dated. Remember, the change team just opted to use the same information, the same messaging that they had used a couple of years ago, thinking that was well developed. People seem to like it then, so why not use it again? And then we'll talk about some strategies to reposition the change as meaningful, so give it a refresh. So why is using stale dated messaging problematic? Why is it wrong to just repeat old messaging that we've heard over and over again? Well, it can be that the change itself and or the messaging no longer has relevance and meaning. It's no longer a priority. So it doesn't matter how much the change team focuses on the messaging. People just, it's not seen by staff as being a high area of priority, and therefore it's not resonating. It's no longer seen as meaningful and something that's important and we need to invest time and energy in. It also could be that the change is just seen as too ambitious. It's just too much to do, and maybe pre-pandemic we could do that. But for now, we need something that's much more scaled down and much more feasible as far as achieving those changes. So that may be part of how they need to shift the messaging regarding this change. It also could reflect that the change team itself just doesn't have the energy to begin to lead and guide this change process, which is a concern. And perhaps most importantly, it undermines the staff, the stakeholders, their confidence in the change team and their ability to actually lead this change process, which again can really create concerns regarding the riskiness of this change process. So some suggested strategies regarding the messaging for the change. So again, first, most important is to reconfirm that this area of focus is still a priority. And assuming it is, then to think about, okay, how can we refresh the messaging, and consider these 3 points that we want messaging or communications. How we talk about the change first needs to be compelling, that it matters, that it's something important, so we see the benefits of it. It needs to make sense. So it needs to be evidence-based, that it's a priority, that we can see the benefits that it'll have for the persons that we care for. And good strategic messaging recognizes what are possible sources of opposition and therefore tries to counter that with other viewpoints. Persuasive in that it is clear, so it's very clear what it is that we're wanting to achieve. The values align with those in our teams, our organization, and a positive tone, meaning it's about collaboration, it's about solutions. And last, dynamic. One that's not created simply by the change team, but reflects language of the staff. It's refreshed and it emphasizes that change works and is workable. In terms of the messaging, to consider these 6 elements: the context, what we say and why we are saying that, why the shared purpose of this change. We can use data or numbers to illustrate the change itself. We can use metaphors in cases of change that's complex or abstract to support understanding. The messenger, who talks about the change. And we say it's important that these are good communicators. They don't have to be the best public speakers, but good communicators who can convey the message, the meaning of the change. Visuals can be very helpful. Visuals tell a story in a different way and can be very powerful. And lastly, the tone, that it's one that is collaborative and positive. And most importantly would be the what and the why of the message and the messenger who is speaking the change. And then again, some resources you may find helpful about framing the change. We've got a worksheet and a checklist that you can access.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So we've touched on 3 common problems so far: loss of momentum, energy for change, messaging the change initiative. Let's take a closer look now at the 4th common problem, which is opposition to change. So why is opposition to change problematic? Without the support of all stakeholders affected by the change initiative itself will not be successful or sustainable. Opposition can present as a barrier to change. Therefore, addressing these barriers will ensure that the change initiative is feasible, acceptable to staff, less costly. And when I say less costly, we're speaking about, let's say, for example, we have a champion that has been given dedicated time away or protected time to work on a change initiative. If you're constantly having opposition or you're not able to address the opposition from staff, then that time might not be used adequately. And in that sense, it could be costly. And you also want to ensure that the change initiative itself is sustainable. So here are some guiding questions to consider when addressing opposition to change. You want to identify what is the source of the opposition. How many people are opposed to the change initiative? Looking closely at the change and how it will be, how your change agents will be affected by it, how your stakeholders will be affected by it. So let's say you have an individual who is high support and high influence. It means that they'll be very involved in that change process. Or maybe you have an individual that is low support and low influence. It could be that they're not regularly involved in the processes of the organization and might not be affected, their work might not be affected by that change. And so you also want to ask yourself, is the timing appropriate? Are there multiple projects happening at the same time? And is it feasible? And then also you want to know, why is the change needed now? Some possible sources of opposition include a lack of receptivity and also lack of motivation. But you may encounter other sources of opposition within your organization. So some suggested strategies to address opposition to change include engaging all stakeholders in the change process, including those with lived experience. So thinking about your patients that you serve. Also, you want to pay attention to the staff attitude or receptivity towards the change, as no change can occur in the absence of positive attitude towards the change. Also, avoid using education as an implementation strategy to overcome opposition, as it will not address the underlying problem or concern. Also, helping stakeholders to understand the why is important, and answering questions about why now is equally important. In addressing the why and why now, you need to frame the need for change in a compelling way that moves the team to a place from opposition to support. Consider also implementing change in phases and celebrating those small wins that we spoke about earlier, and empowering champions and change agents to lead the implementation process. Lastly, maintaining open lines of communication with all involved is very important. So as you may recall that we asked you earlier to think about whether the team should resume the change at the select, tailor, implement phase, or start over the process by going back to identifying the problem itself. So I'll take a moment to hear the responses that Patricia collated in respect to this.
Well, hi, Macy. I do see a large number of participants say start over, and the common reasons that they give was that a lot of has changed in the past 2 years. Some people have said that you may have to go back a few steps, but a lot of people said that you may need to conduct another gap analysis, reassess the local context as well. There are some people who have also said that there's a need to evaluate if you need to start over or if you can pick up from where you began. Overall, I see there is some consensus among the participants that it is really important to reassess and reevaluate what your current barriers are, what your local and facilitators are, what your staff context is like, because indeed a lot has changed since the past 2 years when the pandemic began.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Patricia, for that overview. And thank you to our participants for your responses and your rationale. I want to give you some things to think about if you choose to do either, because there's really no set way in which you should do this, either start over or continue on. It all depends on the context and what's happening. So as a change team, you need to ask yourself, if you're planning to start over, then you have to ask yourself, what factors will determine this? Also, Would you expect after 2 years that the results of the gap analysis to be the same? Would the priority recommendations be on change? Do you need to add new members to the change team? Do you need added support to that change team? If you're choosing to move forward, you may also need to consider, is returning to the BPG implementation a return to normal and therefore welcome? Is BPG implementation a means of refocusing on the clinical care as an investment in the staff capacities? Also, what can be kept regarding the change initiative prior to the 2-year gap? What has worked well? And are there new lessons learned from the pandemic that you can apply to implementation? Catherine, would you like to add anything to this?
Yeah, thanks, Macy. I think as coaches, and Patricia, Macy, and myself and other colleagues have the opportunity to support BPSOs in their journey through implementation of BPGs. And I can certainly understand why they would want to just pick up where they left off, having done it successfully before. But I can quite agree that the context and the impact of the pandemic can't begin to be underestimated. And I wonder if some of the problems they're encountering in our case scenario is as a result of this decision to move forward. Starting all over again, while it's never easy, it may go quite well because they've done it before. On the other hand, it may be quite different just because of the impact of the pandemic. But I think I would agree with the advice, unfortunately, to need to start again. And again, it's just recognizing the impact of context on change.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So at the beginning of our discussion today, we mentioned 2 complementary frameworks that can be used to propel change: the knowledge to action framework and the social movement action framework. Just focusing in specifically on the SMA framework, which we have on the slide here, is important that change teams see the change as being valuable and necessary. They must see the benefit of it and be receptive and open to the change. And as champions, it's important to know that for many staff, change can be overwhelming. So maintaining open lines of communication is absolutely necessary. And remember that effective change occurs best when it's grassroots or people-led. There's support from leadership, either through policy or their organizational structure, and that stale-dated communications that no longer inspire staff should be avoided. And ensure that all stakeholders are actively involved in the process of change. So here are some additional relevant resources that you can definitely look at should you want to learn a bit more. And so this is all on our website. So you can click on the link and you will be able to find these resources on our website. So as we prepare to wrap up for today, here are a list of our references or academic sources from which this presentation was created. And on that note, I would like to thank you for listening to our presentations and leave the floor open to questions.
So thank you so much, Jamese and Catherine, for such a brilliant and very engaging presentation. You've given our participants a lot of helpful information strategies today. For myself, one thing that really stood out for me was your discussion on the team's energy domains, particularly how to assess each domain and the strategies for raising the energy. So at this time, I would like to give the audience a chance to ask questions. So if you have questions, please type in the chat box, or you can use the raise hand feature and unmute your lines to speak. So again, please remember to select all panelists and attendees when you post your questions in the chat. I do have a question about whether the slides will be recorded, or will this presentation be recorded? And yes, they are. All the webinars are recorded and are archived on the RNAO website. I do have a question for somebody to reshare the momentum resource. Macy, would you like me to move your slide?
Yes, or we can share it thereafter. We can embed it thereafter if you would like. Okay. For the resource on momentum that we shared earlier. Okay, or would you like us to go back to the slide? I'm not too sure
if you have the link, oh, she said it's fine. Yes, so I think it's all right. Okay. So
On each of the pages where we've linked the resources, you can click on that and then be able to see then where that is in the Leading Change Toolkit.
yes, so yes, all of the slides and the webinars, the slides are recorded and will be archived on the RNAO website. So I do have a question from a participant. You're asking, is there a recognizable tool to assess the individual's energy type needed for the change team?
Yes, so thanks for that question. Yes, the assessment tool that I included in the slide deck is the one that you could use. It can be used for individuals, but really was meant to be used for teams, but completed by individuals. And it looks at those 5 domains of energy and asks, and it has a number of statements pertaining to each of those energy types, and asks individuals to rate themselves. And then you could collate that information to determine the overall pulse, if you will, of the team as far as their energy for change, and then use that to determine next steps.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. I see there's 2 people who have their hands up as well. And is there a way we can promote them to panelists? There's got Ala.
No, we don't need to promote them to panelists,
Oh,
but
I see them now.
I've given them permission to unmute themselves.
Perfect. So I think I've got Ala first. Ala, if I'm pronouncing it right, could you unmute yourself?
I believe you're still on mute.
She's lowered her hand,
Oh.
so I think she has a question.
Okay. I think Sharonea, if you can unmute yourself when you're ready to speak. Hi, Sharonea, you feel free to unmute yourself and let us know what your question is, or you can type in the chat box, whichever is more comfortable. To unmute, so if you want to unmute, you can, if you go to your Zoom screen, if you click on the upper right corner, there's like, you can see 3 dots that appear. If you click it, you should be able to click unmute your line when that happens.
Hi, Patricia, I have to give them permission. So I've given
Oh,
Mark permission to unmute herself.
yes. And I think Sharoni as well.
She's lowered her hand, so.
Oh, she's lower hand.
Yes.
Okay.
I found that, it's Margaret speaking. I found that when I got out of full screen mode, I then had a pop-up that said you could unmute yourself. So I did.
Yeah, that didn't have to do with the full
Yeah,
screen. We just gave you permission, so that's why.
yeah, perfect. Okay, so my question's in the chat, actually.
Do you mind just repeating it?
Yeah, it was, I could see that this webinar would be a very useful piece for several people in the organization and cluster that I'm working in right now. But we have conflicting meetings and this kind of thing. How long does it take for this recording to be posted, please? Is it automatic? Does it take a week?
It will be posted within the next week.
Okay. I'll keep an eye out for it then, and I'll refer it to other people then. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret.
So,
Thanks. And certainly if you have any questions, Margaret or others, you'll have our contact information if you want to reach out. We're always happy to talk about this work.
That's perfect. I'm actually working in a 18-month-long project. I'm not quite, I think, ready for the change that I think that Macy or Jamesy, you had made a point that said education is not what will balance the
Yeah,
change or something. What was that?
Yeah, so it's not
What
the
did you say
only
there?
implementation strategy that you can use. So
Okay.
let's take, for example, you might have a change that you're doing within your organization, but your staff is very knowledgeable about that change and what that entails, but that might not be the problem. It might just be that they don't see that it fits with what they do. So it's not
Yeah.
really about your understanding of it, but maybe the fit of that initiative that you
Okay.
have to think about. So it's not the only implementation strategy to consider. And that's what was being mentioned, yeah.
Okay, because sort of in my mind, naturally, I sort of go to the more education, the more
Yeah.
palatable the change will be. Correct?
Yeah. So you have to use a multitude of strategies and not just one for it to be effective. So
Okay.
education can be one strategy depending on the local context and what's happening in your organization. But you might have to employ other strategies also.
Okay. Thank you for that.
No problem.
I do have another question from our participant. The question was, given the human resources shortage and burnout among the staff, what strategies can be used to reignite momentum?
I think this is, I guess I can touch on this, but I think this is a very relevant question in our time and in the pandemic right now. And in terms of strategies, definitely being able to help staff refocus on what is needed to be done is important in terms of that momentum piece, but also you have to understand the challenges that your staff are undergoing with deployment, with movement to different units, and all these things. You have to consider how that's impacting them and might also be draining them energy-wise. So you have to really carefully look at your context and see what is happening in my organization that might be inhibiting my ability to guide momentum or actually reignite momentum within the change team. So you have to kind of focus in really on that component. And also it might just be a case of framing. Maybe you need to reframe the change initiative itself. Maybe people have lost, because it's been 2 years, right? Maybe they've lost the general sense of what the aim is, or what are we trying to accomplish. So you might have to create a new frame or frame it in a different manner that applies to where they are right now and your local context at this present moment. So looking at things like that could be some strategies that the team can use to really regain momentum. Catherine, did you want to add anything to that also?
Yes, I see someone saying take small steps. Absolutely. I would say confirm or reconfirm that the area is still one that is a priority. Seek solutions that work and are workable, and small wins. Scale it down. What can we realistically do to help, bring people back together for this focus, create change successfully, and try and navigate our way through a pandemic that continues ongoing.
Yeah. And I think also to mention that being inclusive, so a lot of organizations have new staff and new people orienting to the organization. So being inclusive of those individuals that have joined the organization is also important, because there can also be new change agents or new champions that can assist in terms of regaining momentum.
Thank you for the excellent answer, Jamesi and Catherine. So I see a lot of the participants are saying thank you to both of you for such an engaging and informative presentation. So I just want to wrap it up and say that we have quite an engaging discussion today. And I would like to thank everyone for taking the time out from your day to take part in this webinar. If you have more questions, please feel free to send an email to me, or Catherine after the webinar. So again, for those of you who are participating in this live webinar, you will soon receive a link to an online survey to evaluate today's presentation. After you have done this evaluation, you will receive your certificate of attendance. In addition, please let us know if you're suggesting topics that you would like us to work on. So again, please know that this work is funded by the Government of Ontario. Again, thank you again for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.